a report that has caused a flutter, news agency Reuters has quoted sources as saying that Chinese President Xi Jinping is likely to skip the summit of G20 leaders in India next week. The report says that according to two Indian officials, a diplomat based in China and one official working for the government of another G20 country, it's the Prime Minister of China, the Premier, who is expected to represent Beijing at the summit on the 9th and 10th of September in New Delhi. Those spokespersons for the Indian and Chinese foreign ministries haven't commented on the matter yet. Significantly, this development comes close on the heels of a massive controversy over yet another provocation by China. The country's Communist Party government on the 28th of August released what it termed as the 2023 edition of the Standard Map of China. The map shows the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh, which Beijing calls South Tibet, and Ladakh's Aksai Chin region, occupied during the 1962 war within China's borders. In other words, claiming these areas as part of Chinese territory. The map instantly drew a sharp response from India. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar said these are absurd claims. He added it was an old habit of China to put out maps claiming territories that don't belong to them, and that the Modi government was very serious about this issue. Dr. Jaishankar said China has put out maps with territories not theirs. Old habit. Putting out maps with parts in India doesn't change anything. Our government is very clear about territory. Making absurd claims does not make other people's territories yours. Earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin had conveyed to Prime Minister Modi on the phone his inability to attend the G20 summit, saying the focus was on the special military operation, in other words, the Ukraine war. At multiple G20 ministerial meetings ahead of the summit, both Russia and China opposed joint statements that included paragraphs condemning Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. Xi and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a rare conversation on the sidelines of the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg last week and discussed reducing tensions in the bilateral relationship that has been steadily deteriorating since the Galwan clashes between the militaries of the two countries in June 2020 that left 20 Indian soldiers dead. Of course, this is hardly the first time that China has provoked India in this fashion. In April this year, China decided to quote-unquote rename 11 places in Arunachal Pradesh. This was seen by observers as a response to India holding events in Arunachal Pradesh in the lead up to the G20 summit, something that Beijing had opposed. Now, New Delhi has repeatedly called out China's expansionist plans. Ever since this new map came out, many had raised doubts over whether Xi Jinping would attend the G20 summit in India. The question, however, is why this provocation now on the eve of the summit? Why did Beijing release the so-called standard map and get it amplified by its propaganda media through social media platforms? Some experts say the answer lies in the recently concluded BRICS summit in Johannesburg, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a brief interaction with President Xi Jinping at the Leaders' Lounge of the summit. It is understood that China wanted a bilateral meeting with India on the sidelines of the summit and push for normalization of ties without conceding an inch on the pending problems in eastern Ladakh. Now, given the schedule restraints of Prime Minister Modi, the formal meeting between the two leaders could not take place and was limited to a brief interaction instead. Now, even during this brief interaction, Prime Minister Modi raised his concerns over the border issue, clearly indicating that the road to normalization of ties goes through disengagement and de-escalation on the eastern Ladakh border and resolution of the remaining friction points. Experts say it is evident that President Xi Jinping is miffed with Prime Minister Modi's unambiguous response that normal ties can only resume once the PLA withdraws its forces from occupied Aksai Chin and that Indian Army's patrolling rights are restored in Depsang Bulge and in Demchok. Therefore, they argue that it's not difficult to presume that China released the so-called standard map to needle India. And by deliberately releasing the map on the eve of the G20 summit, China has clearly indicated that it treats India as an adversary. and will put coercive pressure on India for having close ties with the United States and Quad powers. Experts say this means China will keep the military pressure up all along the line of actual control and also arm its tributary state Pakistan to put pressure on India's western borders. With the PLA throwing both the 1993 and 1996 bilateral peace and tranquility agreements into the garbage bin with their 2020 transgressions in eastern Ladakh, India has to be prepared for worse. China may have its expansionist designs, but India refuses to play second fiddle to its hostile neighbor. The question we're asking on Global Lens tonight is this: what does Xi Jinping's decision to skip the G20 summit in New Delhi signal? And what does it mean for the already strained India-China ties? All right. Let's go across to Ramakrishnan Sridharan, our consulting editor, who joins us live from Washington, D.C. We're also hoping to be joined in a moment by Ambassador R.P. Kaushik, former Indian diplomat. Shri, welcome to Global Lens. Let me start with you. For some, this was a bit of a shocker that days after President Putin said that he wasn't going to attend the G20 summit in New Delhi, now you have the Chinese president saying he's not going to come. Obviously, there is no official confirmation of this yet, but as I said, this is a Reuters report which quotes reliable sources. What should be read into Xi Jinping's very controversial decision to give the G20 a miss?
So, Neha, you would have noticed that, usually at very important occasions, like weddings, birthdays, office gathering, there's always that one person who believes in raining on everyone else's parade by saying or doing something or behaving in an inappropriate fashion. And unfortunately, Neha, China is turning out to be that one country. This is, if Mr. Xi Jinping ends up not actually attending the G20 summit, then sadly, Neha, there's only one way to read this. This is China showing its diplomatic middle finger, not just to India, but to the global community. After all, Mr. Xi Jinping is not in a Putin-like situation where he's waging a war and there's an international arrest warrant against him. So he has no good reason for not coming. And at a time when U.S. president is going to be there, other important national leaders are going to be there, and we are talking of bringing in other African countries into this. And there is a global declaration which is in the works, which commits these nations to sustainable development and progress together. So Mr. Xi Jinping has absolutely no reason for not coming. So I think the reason goes way beyond just the map incident with India. I think this is China sending a message back out to the world at a time when it is getting isolated. There is pressure from the U.S. and very clearly, there's a lot of pressure from the U.S. and China is trying to assert its own position. So this, I think, is a very, very clear message which Beijing wants to send to the world, saying that I'm not going to play this game if you don't treat me, with respect, or you don't give me what I want. So that is something which is not acceptable. So on that note, Neha, let me remind you what happened at the Quad meeting in March this year, where very uncharacteristically, the Japanese foreign minister actually made a pointed reference to China and said that, China has nothing to worry about Quad as long as, it abides by international rules and norms and is willing to operate under the international institutions which are there, the multilateral institutions are there. This was very uncharacteristic and unexpected because, no Quad member country has actually ever said that Quad is in some sense to counterbalance China. So this was quite surprising. But if the Japanese foreign minister felt compelled to make this statement, it's because of China's growing intransigent behavior on the global stage, Neha. So, if China continues to behave like this, I don't think multilateralism actually has a chance. This is bound to fail. So we need China to come together, and China needs to realize that it has a moral responsibility to be part of the world community and, not always harp about its own ambitions, its own petty grievances, and use that as an excuse to derail multilateral efforts for larger causes like, dealing with climate change, global poverty, or sustained development, Neha.
Well, you're quite right there, Shri, that, China's expansionist designs and hegemony are now well established. It's not just India that is at the receiving end. Most countries in the region actually are. The United States is locked in a perpetual superpower battle with China. But I think it would be safe to say that now China is acting as a bully. As you said, trying to rain on somebody else's parade. But what message are you really trying to send out? Because like you said, this is not a Russia-like situation. China's not fighting a war somewhere. But by trying to act difficult like this, all China is perhaps doing is adding to its own increasing global isolation. But I want your thoughts on what some observers have said in this Reuters report, which I find absolutely fascinating, Shri. This report says that, if we want to know why this provocation with regard to the map came on the eve of the G20 summit, the answer lies in the BRICS summit. That Xi Jinping wanted a formal meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, he wasn't granted one, and it's almost as if he's now throwing a fit, saying, you did not give me what I wanted, so I am not coming to your party. Do you believe that there is merit in this argument? And especially given the fact that even in that brief interaction that happened between the two leaders at the Leaders' Lounge, Prime Minister Modi made it abundantly clear, you want to normalize ties, disengage and de-escalate first.
So see, Neha, there is absolutely no doubt that as China gets isolated and its role in this region is squeezed out, there's only one other power which can actually fill in that vacuum, which is big enough to be a stabilizing force in that region, and that is India. So obviously, Mr. Xi Jinping and China, they don't want India or Prime Minister Modi to be in a position where its own global stature and importance, especially among Western nations and Middle Eastern nations and African countries, it grows. Because let's say, you have President Biden there at the G20 Summit. And I'm sure if Mr. Xi Jinping had come, there would have been some informal or some meeting that would have been arranged between President Biden and Mr. Xi Jinping. Although, again, China doesn't seem to be in a mood to hold constructive dialogue with even U.S. So that would have been an opportunity where India's, again, stature would have gone up as someone which is trying to bring the two largest forces together, the largest economies together to solve their differences and move ahead in the interest of the larger, world. So that is something, again, which probably, Beijing doesn't want to afford to India. And I think there's definitely some merit in the argument that China doesn't want India to start growing much bigger than what it is right now in terms of the global stature that it has. But to my mind, that is inevitable, and China has to deal with it. And unfortunately, the more it behaves like this, Neha, I have no doubt that India's own importance on the global stage will keep growing.
Well, certainly the rivalry seems to be on display here. The fact that China cannot stomach India's growing global stature, the fact that the Indian Prime Minister was on a historic state visit to the United States very recently, with President Biden calling the India-US partnership the defining partnership of the 21st century. And right now, it would almost seem as if China is friends only with countries that are seen as international pariahs: Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea. Yes, it uses its muscle and financial power to get other smaller nations on its side, using the means of, shall we say, economic imperialism, but that is not even a partnership of equals. Now, looking at the big picture, Shri, what does this decision by China really mean for the G20 summit? Do you think this is likely to throw a spanner in the works for India in any way? Is this likely to be a dampener? Also, what does this mean for the already strained India-China ties?
Right. So Neha, as you know, G20 is a very important multilateral forum. where countries come together to agree on few basic principles on how they're going to work as nations together in the interest of the people at large, of the planet at large. Now, if a country like China doesn't, come in, or if a man like Xi Jinping, who's the leader of the nation, doesn't come in and send someone else who's obviously not, doesn't carry the same weight, either political or moral, to commit on behalf of China, obviously this is going to slow down the whole process. It is going to be a setback for the meeting, and the 1 year which has been spent talking on various issues, the roadmap which has been built, the vision which Prime Minister Modi and India as a leader of G20 this year has said, which is of one planet, one earth, one people, and one family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam kind of a philosophy which India has brought to this whole G20 leadership. That gets a huge setback because China is the largest consumer of resources. It is still a very large economy which is growing significantly at 4-5% a year. So I think China has a huge responsibility to be part of this global community and be part of the framework that is discussed and agreed upon and adhere to that. So without China's participation, Neha, definitely it will be a setback for the multilateral efforts which are being conducted under G20.
It will be a setback to multilateral efforts, there is no doubt about that, and G20 is one of the most important and powerful multilateral forums in the world. Now, of course, there will be a token Chinese presence and a token Russian presence because, the Chinese Premier and the Russian Foreign Minister are going to represent their respective countries. In the past, we've seen how, there has been no consensus on a joint statement because every time the West has wanted to include a condemnation of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, you've had Russia and China putting their foot down. Is that a story that is likely to play out all over again at the G20 summit? Or do you believe that the absence of the top two leaders from these countries could make a difference to the final outcomes of this summit?
It definitely will. Now, let's look at from China's perspective, Neha. As it gets isolated on the global stage and it is upbraided and pulled up and sanctions are imposed on China by countries like the U.S., it needs friends. So now, who better than Russia, which itself is facing sanctions, which itself sees West as an enemy, and blames West for actually causing the war in Ukraine. So it's basically the coming together of two countries which are right now, in some sense, turning into pariahs on the global stage. This is unfortunate, and it is not surprising though. But what I mentioned earlier, this is definitely going to be a setback for any global effort at a multilateral level, where we are addressing larger issues and not just like bilateral issues. We are talking about a responsible kind of a framework for all countries to grow in. How do we ensure that the poorer nations are able to access natural resources without the same kind of commitment which developed nations have to make to climate change and to resource consumption? So unless we have buy-in from a country like China and Russia, two important, Russia is the largest landmass country, and China is the world's largest, in terms of, at least till recently, population, now number 2 in terms of economy. So two large blocks, if they're not part of the G20 and don't willfully commit to certain pledges that are required to take these discussions forward, then it is definitely going to be a setback, and in some sense might even fail the multilateral mechanism that everyone else is working so hard on, Neha.
Well, certainly these are disappointing developments, but that's how complex our geopolitics is today, isn't it? Shri, thank you for that perspective. We'll of course have to wait and see how India officially reacts. Remember, there is still no official confirmation from either side.